Newark, New Jersey, October 14th, 1988. The woman in row 7 had been sitting there for 40 minutes before the first person looked at her twice. Jeans, a plain gray blazer, hair pulled back without a thought. No jewelry except a thin gold chain that disappeared under her collar. The woman beside her was fanning herself with the program. The man to her left had a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. Nobody recognized her. That was the point. Whitney Houston had bought 2 tickets that morning, one for herself, one for her assistant Linda, who was under strict instructions not to say her name out loud. They came in through the side entrance and found their seats before the house filled. Whitney wanted to see Aretha, not as a professional obligation, not as an industry appearance. She wanted to sit in the dark and listen to someone sing the way she used to believe singing was supposed to sound. That morning, the New York Times had run a review of her Madison Square Garden performance. The critic had used 3 words that had been sitting in her chest all day like a stone: impeccably trained but emotionally distant. She had read it twice standing in her kitchen, set the paper on the counter, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window for a long time without drinking it. Clive Davis called it noon. He was satisfied about the numbers. He said the tour was running like a machine. He talked about the next album in terms like crossover positioning and what the format demanded. Whitney listened and said yes at the correct intervals and hung up and stood in the kitchen for another 10 minutes without moving. That was why she had come to Newark. Not to be anyone. To remember something she was starting to forget. The Newark Symphony Hall was full. This was an NAACP Legal Defense Fund benefit concert, which meant the room was nothing like the arenas Whitney had been playing. No production rigs, no laser grids, just a wooden stage, a Steinway grand, a drum kit, and the kind of crowd that grew up singing on Sunday mornings without being told to. Church ministers in the 3rd row. Women in good hats. Men who had heard Mahalia Jackson live and carried that memory like a standard nobody else could measure up to. Aretha Franklin walked out at 8:15, and the room did what rooms do when Aretha appears. Not the screaming a pop crowd makes, something older, the sound that comes out of people when they see someone they trust walking toward them. She played 3 songs, then she stopped. She walked to the front of the stage and the pianist held his hands just above the keys and waited. Aretha looked out at the audience with the expression of someone who had just decided to change her plan. "I've got a situation," she said. The hall went still. "Sandra was supposed to be here tonight. Sandra Reeves. Some of you know her." A few heads nodded. "She came to sound check this afternoon and her voice was gone. Just gone. Doctor says it came on fast." Aretha paused. "She's going to be fine. She's resting. But I need somebody to sing with me tonight and Sandra can't do it." She looked out at the crowd without any performance in it. "I'm not kidding with you. This is Newark. Somebody in this room can sing. I know it." Laughter from a few places. Some people looked around. A few hands went up halfway. The cautious kind, willing to be asked but not responsible for what happens next. In row 7, Whitney Houston was very still. She hadn't planned anything. She had no strategy for this moment. She felt something move in her chest the way you feel when something you forgot you needed is suddenly right in front of you. She thought about the Times Review. She thought about Clive Davis and the word positioning. She thought about the last time she sang something with no format requirement attached to it. She was 9 years old the last time she stood at a microphone and was completely unafraid of her own voice. Linda leaned toward her and said nothing. She just looked. Whitney stood up. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't call out. She simply stood up in the middle of row 7, and the first person to notice was a woman 2 seats to her right who looked up and then looked again and pressed her palm flat against her chest. The recognition moved through the room the way things move when nobody is saying them out loud. Row 7 to row 6. A man in row 4 turned fully around in his seat. A woman in row 3 put her hand on her daughter's arm and leaned close. By the time Whitney reached the aisle, the front half of the hall already knew. Aretha was still looking toward the other side of the room. The pianist saw Whitney first. His hands went flat on the keys and then lifted. He straightened and said nothing. Whitney climbed the stairs at the side of the stage. A stagehand with a headset was posted at the bottom step. He looked at her. He stepped aside without being asked. She walked to center stage and stopped. Aretha turned. What passed between them in that moment was not a performance and not a greeting. It was something quieter. Aretha was her godmother. That was real. But they were also standing on either side of a particular distance. The distance between where Whitney had started and where the industry had been steering her. Aretha looked at her the way someone looks at a person they've been waiting for without being sure they would show up. She nodded once. That was all. The applause that rose had weight to it. People who had grown up hearing both of these women sing were watching them stand on the same stage, and they understood what they were looking at, even if they couldn't have explained it. One of the production crew moved toward Whitney with an in-ear monitor, reaching toward her on instinct. She looked at it. She looked at the full floor setup, the monitor wedges, the processing rack, the reverb and compression chain configured for Sandra's voice all afternoon. "I won't need any of that," she said. The crew member held still. "Just give me a microphone, plain, and keep the piano simple." Someone handed her a Shure SM58, the kind of microphone that lives in church halls and school auditoriums across every state in the country. The same kind she had first stood in front of as a child, next to her mother, at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, when her eyes barely cleared the top of the stand. She looked at the pianist. She said one word, "Precious Lord." He nodded and placed his hands on the keys. The introduction was slow. The hall had settled into a quiet that didn't feel like anticipation. It felt like people who already knew what was coming and were making room for it. Whitney closed her eyes. When she opened her mouth, the first note was not the note anyone expected. Not the note the radio had trained people to expect from her. It was smaller, and it came from somewhere lower, and it had no arc of demonstration in it. It was the voice before anyone had tried to manage or format or position it. The sound of someone singing the way they sing when they are alone and afraid and need the song to be true. The second phrase was where the room changed. A man in the fifth row bowed his head, not as a gesture, just because that was what his body did. A woman near the back wall began rocking slightly, the way people do when music catches somewhere they weren't expecting. The minister in the third row, a heavy-set man in a dark suit who had sat straight-backed all night, leaned forward and put both elbows on his knees and stared at the stage. Aretha came in on the second verse. The two voices met in the space above the piano, and what happened there was not a harmony in the technical sense, though technically it was. It was two women who had learned to sing the same way, in the same kinds of rooms, and had each traveled very different distances from those rooms, and were standing in one now. The song lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the room held still for a long beat. Then it didn't. The applause had no clear beginning. It came from everywhere at once, and it stayed. Aretha walked to the microphone. "That's Whitney Houston," she said, "my goddaughter, and that right there is where she comes from." She didn't add anything to it. Whitney stood at center stage with the SM58 at her side. She wasn't wearing the professional smile she used in photographs. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were wet, and she was not going to cry. She looked like someone who had just done something they needed to do for a long time and hadn't understood how much until they did it. Backstage after the show, the room was small and warm. Aretha had changed out of her stage dress and was sitting with a cup of tea. Whitney had her blazer across her lap. Linda had gone down to the car. Stage crew moved through the corridor outside. Then Sissy Houston walked in. Whitney looked up. She hadn't known her mother was there. Sissy had driven up from East Orange without telling anyone, the way she always did when something in her said to go somewhere. She crossed the room without hurrying. She put her hands on either side of her daughter's face and looked at her for a moment without saying anything. Then she sat down next to her. The three women stayed in that room and talked about ordinary things. Traffic on the turnpike, the cold coming in off the water. Someone mentioned the sandwiches on the catering table were better than they looked. After a while, the conversation wound down, and the quiet that followed was the easy kind, the kind that doesn't ask you to fill it. On the way back to the hotel, Whitney sat in the back of the car and watched the lights on the New Jersey Turnpike pass in the dark. She wasn't thinking about the review. She wasn't thinking about what Clive Davis would say when he heard she had walked onto Aretha's stage without preparation or notice, or a single effect pedal between her voice and the room. She was thinking about the moment before she opened her mouth, the way the hall had gone quiet, the way the SM-58 felt like something familiar instead of something engineered, the way she had sung one song through without once thinking about what it was supposed to do for anyone. She had not been emotionally distant. She had just been there. 8 years later, in 1996, she went into a studio in Los Angeles to cut the gospel soundtrack for a film called The Preacher's Wife. The producer had prepared the full arrangement, choir, orchestration, every layer in place. Whitney listened to the first playback, stood up, and walked out of the booth. "Strip it back," she said. The engineer looked up. "The piano, just the piano. Take the rest out." He did. She went back to the microphone and sang "I Love the Lord" in a single take. When it was done, she stood in the booth without speaking for a few minutes. Then she told the engineer about a night in Newark in 1988, a plain microphone, and a song she had known since she was 9. A room full of people who hadn't come to see her and needed her to be real. "That's the sound I was trying to get back to," she said. She never talked about that night in any interview. It didn't surface in authorized accounts. The people who were in Newark Symphony Hall on October 14th, 1988, held it the way you hold something that happened before you had the right words for it. A woman in a plain gray blazer who stood up from the 7th row and walked to a stage nobody had asked her to walk to, and sang without monitors or any of the machinery built up around her voice, and reminded a room full of people, and maybe reminded herself most of all, that the voice they knew from the radio was not even close to the beginning of what she carried. Have you ever felt the weight of everyone's expectations crushing something real inside you, and then found your way back to who you actually were? Tell us about it in the comments below.